Good afternoon. I am Larry Diamond. I'm the Mosbacher Senior Fellow in Global Democracy here at the Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies, which we call FSI. I'm also a Senior Fellow at the Hoover Institution. I'm coordinating FSI's new Israel Studies program, and I'll be moderating today's webinar. Before we begin, I want to thank three individuals for their support of this event: FSI Director, Ambassador Michael McFall, FSI Director of Communications, Ari Chasnov, and the wonderful Program Manager for our Israel Studies program here at FSI, Kate Tominska. I'll also let you know that we will, with about 20 minutes left, offer an opportunity for participants to have the questions of you, the participants, addressed. If you have questions, you can pose them with the Q&A button. And of course, if you're a Stanford student, we'd love to know that too. If you want to indicate that, please bear in mind, we have a large audience today, and so we may not see all of your questions and comments, but we have some help trying to gather these up and aggregate them. Normally, I'd say it's a pleasure to welcome you, but today there is really only grief, pain, horror, and outrage on gathering to consider this topic. The brutal October 7th attacks on innocent Israeli civilians by the terrorist group Hamas constitute one of the most appalling incidents of terrorist violence in our lifetimes. To date, at least 1,200 Israelis, some of them Arab Israelis, at least 27 of them Americans, have died as a result of the Hamas attacks on Israel. Thousands more have been physically injured and traumatized. Proportionally, this death toll is the equivalent of over 40,000 Americans dying, or more than 10 times the US death toll on 9/11. The Israeli death toll will tragically go up, and some 150 Israelis, as well as US citizens, have been kidnapped and are being held as hostages. The killing and kidnapping by Hamas, as well as sexual violence and other forms of grave physical and psychological abuse, have deliberately targeted civilians, including women, children, babies, and the elderly. Whole families have been murdered intentionally in cold blood. An Israeli Rhodes Scholar alumnus, Ben Luria, recently wrote to his community the following: "These victims are not colonizing settlers. They are not oppressors. An 85-year-old Holocaust survivor in a wheelchair was kidnapped by Hamas. This has nothing to do with decolonization. This is brutality and the manifestation of a racist fundamentalist ideology. Imagine yourself hiding in a locked safe room for 20 hours, protecting your loved ones, while terrorists are entering your home and setting it on fire so they could shoot you when you have to escape for air. There are stories of parents in a safe room having to cover the mouth of their 10-day-old baby, silencing their cries to remain alive and hidden. Hamas is not hiding its radical ideology. It has long been calling, since its founding in 1987, to exterminate all Jews across the world. Then there is the tragedy of, by now, a similar death toll in Gaza, where the Ministry of Health reports more than 1,500 killed in recent strikes. And it will get worse because Hamas knew that Israel would be compelled to strike back to defend itself, and because the terrorist organization has long made a practice of hiding behind innocent civilians to launch and coordinate its attacks, leaving the Israeli Defense Forces with the Hobbesian choice of attacking buildings that house civilians or not responding to terrorism at all. How do we even begin to understand these acts of fanatical cruelty? What happened? Why did it happen? Why did Israeli intelligence fail to anticipate it? And what does it mean for the volatile geopolitics of the Middle East? To help us formulate answers to these questions, we have an excellent panel today. Amichai Magen is the inaugural visiting fellow in Israel Studies at FSI. He's on leave from his role as senior lecturer and director of the program on democratic resilience and development at the Lauder School of Government, Diplomacy, and Strategy of Reichman University. His research and teaching interests address democracy, rule of law, liberal orders, and political violence. He has written widely about governance, regional and international orders, and the advantage of democracy in fighting terrorism. His new book, After Order, Limited Statehood, Order Contestation, and Political Violence in the International System, will be published next year by Stanford University Press. He taught last spring and will teach again this winter a course on Israeli society, politics, and policy. Ori Rabinowitz, a Chevening scholar, is an associate professor of international relations at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem in Israel and visiting associate professor at CSAC here at Stanford. We're very proud to have her in our program as well. Her research interests include nuclear proliferation, intelligence studies, and Israeli-American relations. Her book, Bargaining on Nuclear Tests, was published in 2014 by Oxford University Press. Her work has been published in other leading academic journals and as op-eds and blog posts in the Washington Post, Foreign Policy, and Haaretz. She is currently teaching a course called Israel, the Middle East, and Nuclear Weapons. My longtime friend and colleague, Abbas Milani, is one of the nation's most eminent experts on contemporary Iran and U.S.-Iran relations. He is the Hamid and Christina Moghadam Director of Iranian Studies at Stanford and a visiting professor in the Stanford Department of Political Science. In addition, Dr. Milani is a research fellow and co-director of the Iran Democracy Project at the Hoover Institution. He's published more than 20 books and 200 articles on Iranian history, politics, and culture, including his definitive 2012 biography of the Shah of Iran. This quarter, he is teaching a course on U.S. relations with Iran. So panelists all, thank you for agreeing to join us and reflect on what has happened and where it might go. I'd like to ask our two Israeli politics to reflect specifically first on the events of the last 7 days and the toll it has taken on Israel as a society. Ori, can we begin with you?
Thank you, Larry. I wish we could have met under better circumstances, but here we are. So first of all, I'd like to frame my initial analysis as following. I think it's important to understand what we're talking about: crimes against humanity, which were perpetrated in the area we call Otef Aza, in the immediate Israeli area surrounding the Gaza Strip. The aim was to wipe out the civilian population of this region inside Israel proper, inside the Green Line. You've mentioned this, and I'm not going to expand too much, but the kind of things we've seen included execution of children in the vicinity of their parents and vice versa, torture, kidnapping, and rape. In some of these events were actually broadcast on social media by the perpetrators. They were not hidden at all. The scale is horrific, and I'll try to contextualize this a little bit. It's really mind-boggling. So when we compare it to terror attacks in the West, it was surpassed only by 9/11, where we had approximately 3,000 people, casualties, dead. Here, if we consider the scale of the Israeli population, and you've mentioned this, Larry, it's something like 14 times bigger than the proportional scale. One way to look at it is that it's really difficult to imagine, but we have 140 people who died per each 1 million people of the population. So this this is really a mind-boggling number, no matter how you look at it. Operationally, we need to remember that the border between the Gaza Strip and Israel is relatively short. We're talking about 59 kilometers. It was breached in multiple points of entry, something between 20 to 30 points of entry. This was a massive operation. It entailed several waves of incoming terrorists who participated in the breach. So far as we know, based on the reports coming from Israel, approximately 1,500 bodies of terrorists were recovered from inside the affected areas, and we don't know how many more have managed to escape with the people they've kidnapped and bodies into the Gaza Strip, but we're talking about a very large-scale operation. It took place under cover of a barrage of missile and rockets between 2,000 to maybe 3,000. We don't have the exact numbers yet, which caused a major distraction. It's also, I think, really important to understand as we go forward in framing our discussion here today that operationally speaking, at least, we're not talking about a very advanced warfare or where super advanced technological capabilities were deployed. We're not talking about the coming new war of AI and really advanced capabilities. Yes, drones were used. They were used in a very it took the Israelis by surprise in terms of the tactical deployment of these drones. They were used to basically blind the lookout position, the electronic lookout positions that were stationed on the border. But other than that, we've seen tractors, jeeps, motorcycles, and paragliders used in these waves of attack. In terms of the toll on Israeli society, I can tell you that it's trauma compounded by failure of the Israeli state, the army, and the institution to respond immediately at all levels. And this is an ongoing trauma which will affect the Israeli society as a whole. It really brought to the surface images not of the Yom Kippur War, which is maybe what some people thought initially, but really images of the Holocaust. And you've touched on this, Larry, in some of your opening remarks of Jewish children, elderly, and people in general being executed, people being holed up in bomb shelters and rooms, suffocating hours on end. And the IDF was not there to immediately respond. It was certainly not there in immediate numbers. It took very long hours for these villages and places of settlement to be recaptured. In few instances, it actually took more than a day. One of the problems which has surfaced is that 80% of the IDF's regular deployment was deployed in the West Bank, and this is something that's being internally discussed in Israel. It's difficult to talk about it, and many Israelis feel that the basic contract of the citizens with the state had collapsed that day in terms of the failure of the state to supply the basic protection. And I should also mention that many in Israel, and I think, and I suspect that this voice will grow in terms of the toll on the Israeli society. There's an ongoing failure by Prime Minister Netanyahu, who's the Prime Minister under whose term this event has happened. There's a failure of leadership which is astounding and far-reaching. The government did not respond to the basic needs of the people of the region when, on the day that this happened, in terms of organizing their evacuation, food, and shelter. Those who survived the massacre found that they were basically alone. They weren't alone because Israeli civil society is strong and resilient, and the civil society has taken on the role of providing what the government and the institution should have provided. Soldiers called up for duty were driven to the front by their parents and by family friends. People in need had to go to crowdsourcing to make sure that the basic needs are met. Ministers and politicians who in other times would have tweeted within minutes about every issue relating to the judicial reform that the government was planning remained silent for days. One example is the communication minister, Shlomo Kari, went on TV saying, and I'm quoting, "The government should evacuate Sderot." The interviewer had to remind him that he was the government. Mm-hmm. Not to mention the fact that the unity government took 5 days to form. I will stop here, and I'm looking forward to hearing the other comments.
I want to get into the analysis shortly, but Amichai, please add what you'd like to the initial just recounting of what has happened.
Thank you, Larry. Thank you, Abbas. Thank you, Ori. Ori, you've covered many of the most salient points. I also want to recognize the fact that we have over 1,100 participants in this webinar right now, which I think demonstrate not only how salient and important this issue and these incidents are to human beings as human beings, but is perhaps indicative of the level of care and support of the Stanford community and the broader community for what's happened over the last few terrible days. These have been mainly sleepless days for us. I don't want to get too graphic. I will just mention that my own sister was within 2 miles, her family, 3 children, within two or 3 miles of where these atrocities have occurred. My wife, Merab's family is mainly based in the southern part of Israel, and they have been under a constant barrage of missiles and rockets, and they continue to be under a barrage of rockets and missiles. This hasn't stopped or abated by any means. And of course, the great anxiety is that other Iranian proxies in the region, from Hezbollah in Lebanon, various Shia militias in Syria, Iraq, even Yemen, may join in, and that within a very short period of time, Israel may be facing 5 or 6 different fronts simultaneously, and that is certainly contributing to the anxiety and the distress. I think that what we got on that terrible day of Saturday, October 6th, is the most painful, poignant, tangible reminder of what would ever happen to Israel if Israel were ever to be overwhelmed by its enemies. We can theorize about that, and people have theorized about that, but on Shabbat of October 6th, we saw with our own eyes, and we saw in disbelief the brutality and the total disregard for the most basic principles of morality and humanity. And we saw what happens when Israelis, Muslims, Druze, Christians, Jews, Hamas, and Palestinian Islamic Jihad did not distinguish between them. What happened to them when they were defenseless? What really happened over the last few days is that Israelis woke up from 3 fundamental illusions, and I'll just mention them so that we can discuss them. The first illusion that was broken is that one can coexist with Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad. Over the last 3 years in particular, Israel was lulled into a concept, a strategic concept, that presumed that with the right kind of material incentives, with enough money from Qatar and from Iran, with enough concessions and assistance to the population in Gaza, work permits, additional investment and money that would come into Gaza, that would create some kind of modus vivendi with Hamas that would allow Israel to coexist with it. And that concept was shattered. The second illusion that was broken, and it would take many, many years, perhaps decades, for Israel to recover from this, is what Ori has already mentioned. The illusion that the state of Israel and the IDF are able to effectively protect the civilian population. The reason why this is a much bigger trauma than Yom Kippur is because on Yom Kippur, there was a very high military death toll. but the civilian population was protected. No Israeli towns and moshavim, kibbutzim were occupied, and no women were raped and children beheaded. That did not happen here. There's a third illusion from which I think we all just woke up, and that is the illusion that global jihad was gone. The last time that we really paid attention to global jihad, and let me just mention that Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad, that is the second major Iranian proxy that is based in Gaza, declared today to be a day of global jihad. Jewish schools, Jewish institutions all around the world are closed or have required to higher protection. The last time we all were thinking about this was with the fall of ISIS's rule in Raqqa and Mosul. That happened in 2016. And so for 6 or 7 years, we've been thinking about other things. We've been thinking about great power competition or populism, but we've sort of neglected the risk of mass terrorist atrocities. And we received a reminder that global jihadism has not disappeared. And this is a cautionary tale. As we know, sometimes Israel is the canary in the mine. What happens in Israel today may tragically happen in the United States or elsewhere in the future. So I think that Larry, helps us to get a sense of what the immediate ramifications are. The longer-term ramifications are still unknown.
Right. So we've now transitioned to the question of why, how this could happen. Let me turn to Abbas and ask you, Abbas, as a scholar of Iran and its behavior in the region and its ambitions in the region, and as a scholar of the region, you've traveled extensively throughout it, to put this in a regional perspective and explain to us both what Iran's relationship with Hamas is, what motive Iran might have had for supporting and encouraging a Hamas attack on Israel, what, if anything, we actually know specifically about Iranian encouragement or assistance, and then we'll come back to the Israeli domestic dimension of this.
Well, thank you very much for having me, although it's a sad day. I, as an individual, offer my condolences to every family that has suffered in this brutal attack. I, as an Iranian, again, I speak for myself. I don't speak for anybody else. I'm ashamed of the behavior of the Iranian regime in all of this. And I'm ashamed of the way they have been celebrating these massacres as acts of victory. My heart goes out to the hostages. I hope for their speedy recovery. But my heart also goes out to the 2 million citizens of Gaza who are also hostages to this catastrophe. I think 2 million Palestinians deserve to be considered as fully entitled human beings. They should be considered as hostages to this brutal regime that rules over them, and any way that their lives can be protected, I think, would be best for the future of the Middle East, and I think would be best for the future of Israel. Now, there is much talk about whether Iran ordered this, whether Iran gave the green light. I think that misses the point. Iran created Hamas in this sense. Iran is the architect of the narrative that the future of the Middle East must be a future without Israel. Iran's supreme leader has categorically, repeatedly, often shamelessly said Israel is a cancer that needs to be moved. Khamenei has written to Mr. Haniyeh, the leader of Hamas. I was reading his letter just this morning, that we are going to support you in our religious duty to remove this problem from the Middle East, referring to Israel. And the time of and the form of the attack is up to you. In other words, the context is set very clear. We're going to support you, and we want you to do this fight. Iran has been adamant in undermining the two-state solution in Israel. Iran has been from day one the force that undermined Oslo. Iran has been undermining the two-state solution. And in this effort, as both of my Israeli colleagues know better than I do, they were helped by the extremists in Israeli politics who also undermined the two-state solution. They assassinated Rabin, and that put the Middle East in a trajectory that allowed the radicals in Palestine and the radicals in Iran derail what to me is the only solution for a lasting peace in the Middle East, which is a two-state solution in the Middle East and an Iran with a democratic government. I think what Amichai was saying, this should bring us to end this illusion that the West has, that the United States seems to have, the Biden administration seems to have, that you can make enough concessions to this regime in Iran, you can maybe release billions of dollars to it, and that it's going to become a law-abiding member of the international community. This regime is not going to abide by laws. It's not going to abide by its commitment. It is murderously suppressing the Iranian people, and it is planning. I can talk a little bit about the way they're talking about the future of the Middle East. They clearly see as a turning point for their rise. They see this as a turning point for the demise of Israel and for the demise of the West.
Well, thank you, Abbas, for everything you said. Knowing this, Israel has, I think, a lot of experts on terrorist organizations in the region, including Hamas, and we'll get to Hezbollah, and a lot of experts on Iran. There is the question of why this could happen, why Israel could be taken by surprise, and why an attack turned into a calamity. Amichai and Ori, do you want to help us understand even a little better from an Israeli perspective how this could have become not just an attack, but an attack on such a calamitous scale?
Well, it's I'll start briefly and then hand it over to Ori. It's very tempting to jump to conclusions, and we all have our thoughts about how this colossal intelligence failure, followed by a colossal operational failure, could have happened in a country that prides itself on its world-class intelligence agencies, technological capabilities, what is called SIGINT, right? Signal-based, technological-based intelligence, and human-based intelligent sources. All of those clearly failed, but I think we'll only get the full picture once a national committee of inquiry is established at the end of this conflict, which it undoubtedly will. So we need to be a little bit epistemologically humble and not jump to conclusion. Having said that, I think there are three main factors that really came into the equation. One was Israel was clearly perceived to be vulnerable and divided internally, and the enemies pounced. We in Israel, again, we tend to think that we watch very carefully what is happening in the neighborhood. The neighborhood also watches us. And the leaders of Hamas and the leaders of Hezbollah and Iran know Israeli society and understand Israeli society very intimately. And when they see that fighter pilots are declaring that they will not turn up for military duty to serve a government whose democratic credentials are eroding, when they see the entire Israeli elite busy bickering and castigating one another as traitors and so on and so forth, they sensed vulnerability and they exploited that moment of vulnerability. But I don't think that's the entire story. I think that secondly, remarkably, Israel suffered from a failure of imagination here. Israel thought that its technology would protect it, that the Iron Dome system provided it with security. And we, once again, received a lesson that is applicable not only for Israel, but also for American national security and the national security of free countries all around the world. Be very, very careful not to be complacent, not to be over-reliant on technological superiority, and to always remember the terrorists learn and they adapt and they devise new strategies and new mechanisms to exploit weaknesses. And thirdly, and I think we've already touched upon this, there was a certain Israeli naivete about Hamas, remarkably, amazingly, a belief that a deal could be struck and that rational material considerations would trump the murderous genocidal ideology of Hamas. For those of you, for those watching us, listening to us, I really invite you to go to your favorite browser and just enter the words Hamas Charter. You'll get an English language document that lays out Hamas's constitution and its aims. Hamas does not hide its goals. It tells us exactly what it intends to do. It intends to establish a radical, oppressive caliphate over the ruins of the entire territory of the State of Israel. This is not about settlements. This is not about this border or that border. It is a worldview that, as Abbas Milani has articulated, sees the very existence of the Jewish people in the land of Israel as being a cosmic injustice that must be ended. And yet, time and time again, policymakers, including in Israel, believe that practical accommodations could be reached. And this time we discovered that that wasn't the case, with horrific costs and consequences.
Thank you, Ori.
I think I would like you, with your permission, to elaborate on some of the points that Amichai made. Conceptually speaking, there was an assumption that Hamas is just not interested currently in an immediate flare-up. Obviously, this also has to do with the intelligence failure that we'll have a better grasp of it once the fog of war is over. But what we can say now for certain is that the wrong assumption within the Israeli political military echelon was that Hamas was not interested in a flare-up, and that the sticks and carrots of offering more work permits and different accommodation would somehow maintain existing modus operandi. Like Micha said, and this was flagrantly wrong. And it was based on a larger assumption that Hamas is currently motivated largely by political calculations and not ideological ones. And I think that it was very clear to see that the ideological calculations trumped the political calculations. And this is based on a deeper political consumption that Hamas could be kept weak and deterred, and in serious rounds of flare-ups on the border, like we saw in 21 and before. You could, proverbially speaking, keep it at bay, And the big sin here is the conception that a weak Hamas is better for Israel than have a Palestinian Authority establish a Palestinian state following the two-state solution in Gaza and the West Bank. And Abbas has alluded to it. This is something that derailing this project has been at the heart of Israeli policymaking in the past 2 decades under Netanyahu, but not only under Netanyahu. It was first formalized under Prime Minister Ariel Sharon, who went ahead with disengagement from Gaza, basically looking to create, to place a wedge between the West Bank and Gaza and make sure that Israel faces 2 separate entities and not one cohesive entity. But under Netanyahu has been Israel's prime minister since 2009, except for 1 year, where he was replaced in office by Bennett and Lapid. We saw repeated Israeli attempts to basically undermine the formation of a Palestinian unity government. Analyst Zvi Barel in Haaretz went and counted at least 14 attempts since 2007. And the strategy was to have these 2 weak divided political entities, despite of the cost. And I'd like to elaborate on what Amichai mentioned in terms of the Hamas charter. In 2017, we saw Hamas put together a so-called revised new charter where they were basically under pressure from Saudi Arabia and Egypt, talked about accepting the 1967 boundaries. This was either just a political maneuver or something drastically has changed the political thinking since 2017 onwards. And in the future, scholars of this age will have to tell us whether a strong trend that we have missed as scholars was a Hamas realignment with Qatar and with the more radical factions in the Middle East on the expense of its former relatively stronger ties with Egypt, which is something that we need to look into. And I'd just like to follow what Abbas said personally, and I'm only speaking here as in my own personal capacity. The human catastrophe in Gaza, for me, it's heartbreaking. I think that it needs to be addressed. I think that it should be addressed. I think that it's in the interest of Israel to make sure that a strong, unified Palestinian actor in the future takes the place of Hamas in Gaza. And we'll talk about some future scenarios down the road, but I don't think it's something we need to overlook or ignore.
Yeah, and that development happen and that people's lives are able to improve under a different kind of political order in what I think many Israelis and many Americans would like to see as a Palestinian state that's ready to live in peace and coexistence with Israel. Let's now move to
Can I say something, Larry?
Yeah.
A continuation of what I was saying and what Amichai was saying. I've read, I'm not an expert on Israeli politics, but I've read a lot of stuff in the last few days that seems to indicate that the Netanyahu government initially thought that because Hamas is an Islamist state, it's a better choice than the secular democratic Palestinian Authority. So if we can divide them, you can sort of render moot the idea of a two-state solution. Israel made the same mistake in Lebanon in thinking that an Islamist Shiite group would be better than PLO, and they look favorably to the rise of the Islamists. That kind of illusion, I think, has to end. Radicals, not all Islamists, radical Islamists are keen on creating an Islamic state. If you want, I can talk about how Khamenei talks about the future. They think they have turned a corner and the future belongs to them. They literally call it a historical term, and they take it from the Muslim Brotherhood, from the writings of Sayyid Qutb, and they say Christianity and Judaism, capitalism, materialism, they're all on the decline, and Islam is the only game in town, and we're going to force that on people whether they want it or not.
Yeah, they want to eliminate everything else. Abbas, thank you for introducing the wider regional implications and Lebanon, and in particular, the role of Hezbollah. I'd like now for us to think a little bit about the potential, horrific though it might be, for an even wider war and the possible geopolitical scenarios with Iran playing the role it does. So I will turn back to you, Abbas, first to tell us a bit more about the Iranian relationship with Hezbollah as an actor, and what you see as a potential scenario in that regard.
As Sheikh Nasrallah has repeatedly said, I've heard several of his interviews. Hezbollah
That is the leader of Hezbollah.
That's the leader of Hezbollah. He says Hezbollah was created, funded, educated by the Islamic Republic, by the IRGC, by the Quds Brigade.
Iran, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard.
Iranian Revolutionary Guard. And Hezbollah now says that they have over 150,000 missiles that can hit anywhere in Israel. And occasionally they have lobbed a few to show that they can. And they're hinting, as we speak, I think is still there. Iran's foreign minister just went to Lebanon, had a meeting with Sheikh Nasrallah, had a meeting with other members of what they call the Axis of Resistance. Some officials from the Shiites in Iraq have indicated that they might be willing to join groups. In Iran, they're talking about, I think they're mostly talking about it, but they're talking about organizing youth groups to send to the front in support of Hamas. So the danger, I think, exists. Khamenei, after the videos came out, the videos of atrocities came out, and they realized that Iran might be implicated, Khamenei tried to walk back. He said, we have nothing to do with this. This is Hamas's all doing. But then some of his henchmen began to go back and say, no, this was Khamenei predicted this. And to go back to the intelligence failure, I have to say, again, I'm not an expert in Israel. I am shocked that they missed all of this. 5 days before this, Khamenei gave a fiery speech threatening anybody who makes peace with Israel, saying that you're betting on the wrong horse. This is the losing horse. And some of his henchmen said, you know, he was actually threatening. He was promising what was happening. How could the Israelis not know that these guys absolutely isolated at home, absolutely isolated in the region, with the rising democratic movement, with the life liberty movement beating on them? They need a foreign confrontation. They needed to create this. It was clear to me that they would see the only surviving, Shakespeare said, keep giddy minds busy with foreign wars. They needed all of this, and they kept talking about it. But I think,
is it fair to say that they needed to sink the possibility of a rapprochement between Israel and Saudi Arabia?
They openly talk about it. He literally threatened. Khamenei literally threatened. He says, don't make peace with Israel. Those who are making peace with Israel, he was talking about Saudi Arabia, are betting on the wrong horse. What's the other horse? The other horse is the axis of resistance that they're now trying to organize. I doubt that they would take on a war with the United States and Israel and the rest of the West that seems to be backing Israel. But I wouldn't be at all surprised if they engage some more confrontation, they create more confrontation between Israel and Hezbollah.
Okay, Amichai and Ori, also like your views on potential scenarios here, and then we'll come closer to home.
Or if I may, let me just follow immediately on Abbas's observations, because I think they're very, very salient. And let me make two points. The absolute masters of proxy warfare in the world are the Iranians, the current Iranian regimes, and plausible deniability is the sine qua non of proxy warfare. Iran is very, very masterful at exploiting precisely this space of uncertainty, and we need to be aware of this. Certainly, there are strategic motivations for Iran and the broader axis of resistance, what is called the mukawama, to sow chaos in the Eastern Mediterranean and the Middle East at the moment. They are aware that the clock is ticking on the American political clock. We have presidential elections in the United States coming up. They are perfectly aware that the Biden administration essentially has 3, 4, 5 months to try to strike a Saudi, US, Israel peace deal. But more importantly, from the point of view of Iran, a US-Saudi defense pact, which is a strategic threat to the current regime in Iran. The second point, a little bit more speculative, but I think we have to be conscious of it. Iran today is essentially a nuclear threshold country. Levels of enrichment are incredibly high. And I don't think we can discount the possibility that under the guise of a regional war with Israel busy on multiple fronts, with the United States busy on multiple fronts, with its proxies doing its work for it, Iran will dash forward and seek to cross that nuclear threshold. I think we need to be very, very conscious of that. Let me add one more sentence about the resistance, the mukawama. We are worryingly seeing the use of the word resistance in the United States, in European campuses and universities. And we need to be aware that this is a code name for violent resistance. So when people are talking about resistance, when they're talking about mobilization, about disruption, be aware that these are really code names for violent resistance. And here we're flirting, crossing the line between protected speech and incitement to violence. And I think there needs to be greater awareness of that etymology and that language. I think that we don't quite understand the language and the signaling game that is being utilized by various actors in this axis of resistance. That includes radical Shia organizations, but also radical Sunni organizations.
I will jump in, following up on some of these points. I think that we may see in the coming days perceived strategic shift in how Iran has been framing and thinking about Hezbollah and its agenda. Up until now, many observers and analysts in the West assumed that Iran keeps Hezbollah's operational capabilities at bay. As Abbas has mentioned, we believe that Hezbollah has somewhere around 150,000 rockets and missiles, some of them with precision-guided capabilities aimed at Israel. And the assumption was that Iran is in the use it or lose it equation, meaning that it would like, ideally, to keep these capabilities afloat to deter Israel from targeting and operating against the Iranian nuclear program and Iranian nuclear facilities. And as Amichai has mentioned, Iran's nuclear program is now quite mature in terms of its capability. They've been enriching uranium to 60% and above, and they're positioning themselves to be quite near the threshold of being able to enrich to 90. And we may perceive a shift in how Hezbollah is seen. If Iran thinks that it no longer needs to keep Hezbollah's capabilities at bay because the Iranian nuclear program is safe enough, it may feel more lax about unleashing these capabilities in an Israeli Hezbollah-Lebanese confrontation. And I think, and Larry, I think we're going to discuss this lastly, I think that U.S. determination and U.S. decision to send a strike force to the area and the Biden administration's insistence on sending very clear deterrence messages have been a part of this equation. And I think when we all need to remember that Saudi Arabia hours ago announced that it is in fact stalling talks of normalization, but I think we all assume that these talks have stalled regardless of a formal Saudi announcement or not. The ongoing war will not see any diplomatic developments on this front. And in this sense, after the war, we'll be able to determine if the Iranian thwarting attempt was successful or not.
All right. Thank you for that. I'd like to turn not only closer to home, but to home for us at the moment, Stanford University and college campuses across the United States, and I'm sure other Western countries that have seen an extraordinarily rapid and painful explosion of intensely polarized sentiments on this issue. And along with it, I have to say, with great pain and alarm, an explosion of not simply sympathy for Hamas and justification, explicit justification, and even celebration of terrorist violence, but pretty direct anti-Semitic expressions and sentiment. One member of the alumni has pointed to a New York Times report today about some of what's been going on. I do want to say that in my roughly 40 years of experience on the Stanford campus, I've rarely seen Stanford University administration act with the swiftness and decisiveness that it did to one of the incidents that was mentioned involving an extraordinary abuse of instructor authority and responsibility in the classroom. This alumna asked, do you have any words of support for the Jewish and Israeli students, faculty, and staff, you know, who are feeling pain, many of them Jewish students unsafe. At the same time, we know that many students of Palestinian descent or who broadly trace their family histories back to other portions of the region or just simply have different views on this are also emotionally distraught. I'll share a few of their questions in a minute. So I'd like you each, maybe I'll start with you, Abbas, to, since you've been here longest on the Stanford campus, to both reflect on the campus climate, the intense tension and feeling of polarization. And also, two of you are teaching courses right now this week. Share any experiences you've had that you might want to share about better dialogue at Stanford. Go ahead.
Well, I did actually have a couple of wonderful dialogues at Stanford. One was in my class. The other one was a talk that I attended by three very prominent Jewish American journalists. One was the editor of Forum, the other one was the editor of Jewish Currents, and the other one is the editor of a local Jewish newspaper. These are prominent. All three are leftist Jewish newspapers, and it was an extremely passionate, serious dialogue about how to talk about these things as journalists, as Jewish journalists. And we also had in my class a very, very wonderful, I thought, and the students told me later that it was a wonderful discussion, where everyone, I thought, was entitled to offer their views, so long as they were respectful, so long as they were termed in academic terms, so long as everyone had the chance to speak their mind and not be accused of this or other tendency. Amichai referred to the abuse that many people make, and I think that's absolutely true, of the word muqawamat, resistance, and think every act of violence is an act of resistance. I think we have to be very clear. Some acts of violence are resistance that is worse than the domination they're trying to fight. It has to be civil. It has to be within the international legal framework that exists. But there is also the complaint that some of the, for example, I hear it from some of the Palestinian students that we can't speak about resistance without being accused of being an extremist. So there are places on the community at Stanford to create these kinds of spaces. I was just reading today about a committee meeting they're going to have at Brandeis. I think you know at least one of the people, Larry. I know you know Shai Feldman, and one Palestinian and one Egyptian, who have been teaching a course on how to make peace and how to make dialogue. For several years, they've written a book together. They're organizing a conference. So the academia isn't all burning in these passionate discussions. There are efforts at Stanford, like today, and many others, to come to a rigorous, fair, multifaceted, multi-sided understanding of how to get out of this traumatic moment that we're caught in.
And I'll just mention, before I turn to Ori next, who's also teaching a course this quarter, that I just attended quite an extraordinary event at Hillel at Stanford on Wednesday evening, where our longtime Middle East peace negotiator, Dennis Ross, and his longtime friend, the Palestinian-American intellectual, a commentator and former advisor to Palestinian authorities in the negotiations, Gaith al-Omari, had an extraordinary conversation with one another and with a wide range of Stanford students. They were challenged, there was debate, but there was civility. That was encouraging. Ori?
I can say, as an Israeli visiting associate professor teaching a course here in Stanford, that the students who came to my class were looking for encouragement, were looking for discussion. They know, and it's the ground, it's the basic rule of my classroom is that there's no indoctrination and people can come with any opinion they want, and we're there to debate and discuss issues. And my personal opinions are exactly that. They're my personal opinions, and I encourage the students to read and research and develop their own opinions. And the students really voiced their deep longing to have safe spaces where they can discuss and explore and become more intimately acquainted with these issues. Specifically, some of the Jewish students approached me and they said they did reflect to me their sense of intimidation, and they told me, some of them just plainly said that they were scared, and this is something that Stanford University would somehow would have to try to address.
Amichai?
Let me say a couple of things. First and foremost, this past few days, Israelis of all religions, all ethnicities, all colors were targeted and murdered by terrorists. I have a dear friend in Israel, an Israeli Arab living in the Galilee, whose family member was a paramedic in the south of Israel and was murdered by Hamas, a young Muslim Israeli citizen, and I mourn him, and I mourn the 4+ dozen Arab Israeli citizens who were murdered this week, just as much as I mourn Jews or Christians or others who were killed this week. There's no question about that. My heart bleeds for every human being that suffers, that is killed, that is maimed, regardless of their religion or ethnicity or skin color. I really think that this goes without saying. I also completely agree with Abbas that we must create constructive space for empathic and sympathetic analysis, conversation, engagement. We need to be able to talk about difficult issues. We live in a difficult world, and we are an academic community that is entrusted with educating the future leaders, not only of the United States, but of the world. And we must be proactive in creating spaces that we can meaningfully and constructively engage in dialogue with difficult issues without fear and without intimidation. There's no doubt about that. And I'm sure I speak for Ori and myself, perhaps also for Abbas and for you, Larry, when I say that we are here for the students. I'm incredibly grateful about the opportunity to speak to so many people online, but I would also very much like the opportunity to sit down more intimately with groups of students from all aspects, all parts of the political spectrum, and be able to talk to each other constructively as human beings to see how do we figure out a path towards greater security and peace for all people in the Middle East. I very much hope we'll be able to do that over the coming weeks and months. Lastly, I just want to say how grateful I am, my family members are, for the outpouring of love and support that we've received from the Stanford community. One's friends are always tested in times of crisis, and sometimes it takes real moral courage to stand and identify yourself and express sympathy and empathy when that is not an easy thing to do. So I'm enormously grateful for that. I wanna say that.
I'd like to add just one more thing. I think it would be terrific if, as a community, we would use the fact that we're not in the Middle East, we're not in Israel and Gaza, and we can use this opportunity to foster more dialogue between the different groups, between different students. And I think it's our job as staffers of this institution.
Thank you, Ori, for caring about that, and all three of you for trying to facilitate it in a civil and thoughtful fashion in the classroom. In that spirit, several Stanford students and undergraduates have raised some, as you can imagine, pretty challenging interventions and questions. Let me pose two of them. I'll group them together and let you, Ori and Amichai, and Abbas as well, respond. One says, in essence, that if you characterize the collective punishment by Israel as a retaliatory attack, you ignore what this student suggests is an important contextualization. That is 75 years of occupation, and this student uses the word genocide of Palestinians. And the student complains that we're only focusing on one side of victimhood. I hope by now this was registered early in our conversation, that it will be realized that we are by no means doing that. The second student asks, you use the word coexist. They regard that as a laughable statement. what kind of life are you asking Palestinians to live in coexistence? One where their homes are taken away from them, where they're living in an open air prison without access to medication and safety. And of course, now there was at least one other comment or question about Israel saying to, I don't know, 1 million people in Gaza that they've got to evacuate almost instantly. Amichai and Ori, do you want to begin by replying however you'd like to that group of questions?
Well, yes. Let me just begin by reiterating what I think is the commitment of all of us, and that is to the dignity and autonomy and peace and security of all people in this incredibly Hobbesian, difficult, and sometimes truly brutal neighborhood. I think sometimes it's very, very difficult for people to understand and to really internalize and grasp the reality under which people in the region are living. Abbas rightly, I think, characterized the situation of 2.3 million people living in Gaza as being hostages. But they're not hostages of Israel. They are hostages of Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad, who used them cynically and terribly and abused them. Israel left Gaza in 2005 in an attempt to bring about the first phase of the creation of a two-state solution. Israel forcefully removed 9,000 settlers. It removed
Israeli settlers,
cemeteries, Israeli settlers from Gaza. It removed graves, Jewish graves in Gaza. The late Shimon Peres, together with the president of the World Bank in 2005, I remember it, went around the world and raised some $300 million to construct greenhouses, hothouses for strawberries to be grown in Gaza, because strawberries is something that Europeans love to eat in the winter, and Gaza could make a lot of money out of selling strawberries to Israel and to Europe and beyond, especially during the winter. Tragically, horribly, within months, not only were the strawberry greenhouses destroyed, and the concrete and metal that was brought into Gaza to try to make it a thriving place, taken by Hamas and used for building rockets and terror tunnels. But rockets started flying across the border, and so imagine yourself in this situation. Imagine if you live in Palo Alto and a radical terrorist organization has taken over San Jose, is holding 1 million people captive there, and essentially turns the population there into hostages to be used as human shields for a terror campaign. That is the tragic reality. That is the painful reality, which, again, I completely agree with Abbas. We have not only a strategic interest, but a moral imperative for ending that reality and releasing Palestinians from the captivity of Hamas. Only when that happens will we be able to move forward, hopefully with the assistance of Egypt, that also shares a border with Gaza, of course, and with Jordan. And let me, if I may, Larry, just one more sentence, because I think there's a little bit of a point of fruitful disagreement between me and Ori. I don't think that this current conflict has destroyed the possibility of Saudi-Israeli peace. In fact, I think that when the dust clears, the strategic imperative to construct a regional axis of stability, a regional axis of sanity, of pragmatic Sunni Arab states in partnership with Israel, in partnership with the United States, in partnership with Europe, in partnership even with Turkey and others, that strategic imperative not only will not dissipate, but it will become starker and clearer. The reality that we are facing is a clash between an axis of resistance that wants to sow destruction and murder and chaos in the Middle East, struggling with an axis of sanity and stability. And we have to stand with the axis of sanity and stability. That is what is at stake here.
So I will comment briefly on some of the questions that we were asked. So as for the context, I 100% agree that the context of the Israeli-Palestinian history and the conflict and what happened is relevant. In my own class, I do talk about it. Personally, and I'm only representing myself, I'm an Israeli leftist. I believe that Israel should work vehemently to establish a Palestinian state and should have done so. I'm personally against the occupation in the West Bank. My family and myself, when we were in Israel, we protest against it. I'm on the side of the group that was lovingly, and I'm being cynical here, labeled by some in the government as traitors. I think that what the settlement project and the settlement expansion should not be there is a mistake, a political mistake, is a moral mistake. I think that the Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank they deserve to have human rights and human dignity. Personally, and again, I'm only talking on behalf of myself, I opposed the Israeli policy on Gaza, and I opposed the way that they handled Gaza and Hamas since 2007 onwards, and I can elaborate on that. And if people would want to have a discussion with me later, go for it. I'd like to talk about specific things that were mentioned. When we talk about 75 years of occupation, my question is, what do we mean when we talk about inside Green Line Israel? Because 75 years is basically referring to May 1948, Israel's establishment. And if people who care to be my interlocutors would like to frame that or analyze that or imply that Israel inside 67 has no right to exist, then I'm not sure what scope we have for a dialogue, because if the program for how to remove or address or tackle that existence is what we saw on Saturday, total brutal annihilation to liberate the land from the existence of Israel, then I'm perplexed as to what it is exactly that we're trying to debate. I'm not sure we have the analytical tools to say Israel inside the Green Line should be removed. Let's talk about it. I for one, as an Israeli, don't have the analytical tools. I can talk about it as a person, not necessarily as a scholar. I believe that Israel has the right to exist inside the 1967 border. As to the term genocide, I respectfully disagree with using the term genocide to describe what's happened to the Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza. I'm willing to debate it. I have a fairly decent grasp of what a genocide is. I respectfully disagree with the decision to use that term, or I also disrespectfully disagree with that decision to use that term. And again, I'm not sure what kind of an analytical basis we have for discussion, but I'm willing to develop it further.
Okay, Abbas, you want to comment on this?
Let me begin with one of the comments that Amichai made. I absolutely agree that the Saudi-Israeli deal is now probably more secure than it was before. no sane country in the Middle East, and Saudi Arabia is increasingly sane, would want to align itself and put its future in the hands of a force like Hamas. So once the crisis passes, I think the tendency to create that alliance is going to be much, much more. Iran, I think, is going to be the loser in all of this. Iran now is full of bombast, but I think they're losers. They're going to be more isolated. There was a question of coexistence. Before I get to that, I have to say that I didn't mean that people in Gaza were hostages to Israel. People in Gaza were hostages to the regime, but people in Gaza have been virtual prisoners of the occupation. That approach has fed into this radicalism that is still, it doesn't represent the wish of the people. If you look at how many people have tried to do the impossible, which is evacuate by 1 million from one side of this very cramped city to the other, and not listen to Hamas, which wanted them to stay there, and get killed, you see that the people there are not following this mad leadership. Somebody asked, what kind of a coexistence is it possible? I think of South Africa. I think of Mandela. The word apartheid has been used in campus discussions, and it's a hot issue. But even in apartheid South Africa, a leader with the wisdom of Mandela found a way to coexist between fraught coexistence. Unless we find, and we don't have them right now, we don't have them certainly in Israel, and we certainly don't have them in Gaza. People with the kind of vision and wisdom and humanity of Mandela, this is not going to get solved. My sense is. So that's how you can coexist, be optimistic, and look at where it has worked, where the problems were even more incredible.
I would like to make 2 points before I ask the last question. The first is, I actually do think we've had periodically in Israel prime ministers who might not have had the rare personal qualities, almost unmatched in post-World War II history of Nelson Mandela, but were ready for peace and offered extremely far-reaching concessions in order to achieve a two-state solution. And I think of Yitzhak Rabin and Shimon Peres. I think of Ehud Barak, and I think of the deal that looked like it might be possible in the final days of the prime ministership of Ehud Olmert, and we could debate those details. It is the very strong feeling of a lot of outside and I think reasonably fair-minded experts, and certainly of most Israelis, that there has not been a partner for peace in a position of political authority on the Palestinian side that was ready to acknowledge the state of Israel as Ori said, at least within the Green Line or some kind of altered and updated manifestation of it, and to live in peace as one of the two states. And I will say, secondly, that if the Palestinian resistance, I don't mind using that term, had adopted tactics of nonviolent resistance, of Gandhian civil disobedience and resistance, this would have been done a long time ago, because international sympathy would, as it always does through tactics of nonviolent civil resistance and willingness to accept a fair compromise, would have shifted so massively that resistance to a two-state solution in Israeli quarters, I think, would have had to melt. Okay, now to the final question. And if you each could be brief, because we're already out of time. What do we see at the other end of the tunnel in terms of what looks like Israeli imminent invasion of Gaza? Who will govern Gaza if Hamas is effectively destroyed as a fighting and governing force? What happens after Israel withdraws? What looks like, it's hard to use the word win here, but some kind of acceptable longer term outcome for Israel? And how does Israel even know when and if it has really lastingly disabled Hamas? So Amichai, we'll start with you and go to Ori and then to Abbas. These will be the closing statements, and try and be as brief as you can. Go ahead.
I'll try to be as brief as I can. Let me just very quickly relate to the point that you made, Larry, and just remind you that whenever the Israeli public was convinced that there was a realistic chance for peace, it voted for a peace government. This is why Yitzhak Rabin defeated Shamir in 1991. And this is why Ehud Barak defeated Netanyahu in 1999. So when the Israeli public sees a credible horizon for peace, they are willing to take incredible risks to achieve that peace. Sadly, every round of rocket fire and violence from Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad, let alone what we've seen over the last few days, shifts the Israeli public further and further to the right, and makes Israelis far less trustful and hopeful about the possibility of coexistence. I fear that the trauma of the last week will manifest itself politically in this way as well. Moving very quickly to your second question, which we could easily spend, and we should spend much more time on. The answer is there is no good answer. Hamas is a deeply entrenched, not only terrorist organization, but primarily a governance organization, a social welfare organization, an ideological organization, and it has been governing Gaza for the last generation, for the last 18 years. It has deep roots in the West Bank and elsewhere. It will be very, very, very difficult to uproot Hamas as a governing organization with deep societal roots in Gaza. And even if Israel were able to achieve the material military goal of seriously degrading and destroying Hamas's physical capacities, changing the ideology, changing the identity of Gazans is not something that Israel can do. It will require a real shift in zeitgeist, in political culture, in Palestinian politics, and beyond. We've mentioned Egypt is not interested in governing Gaza. The Palestinian Authority is incapable, probably, of governing Gaza, and so there are no easy solutions here. There are no good short-term outcomes here. I hate to end this discussion with this, but I think that's the realistic situation that we're facing at the moment.
The one thing I'd like to add to that is that it's far more dangerous to leave a power vacuum for rivaling radicalized factions to vie over control once you remove a powerful dominant actor. And as Amichai said, we don't have an answer yet to who's going to govern once the dust settles, but it's a tremendously important question.
I think that I certainly don't know what the answer to the question is, but I can predict that if Israel does a full incursion, and if there are many casualties, and if the images continue to pour out there as they have been in the last 24 hours, I think the radical resistance, as you call them, are going to be forced by the rhetoric that they have used to engage in some way. Not it may be full war between Iran, but I think if that happens, the rhetoric they have put out there is going to make this a regional conflict, unfortunately.
Well, thank you all for what I think has been a very illuminating and vigorous and heartfelt discussion. I would like to say in conclusion, there have also been questions and comments again about the campus climate, about students, faculty, and staff, Jewish, Israeli, but I'm sure others feeling unsafe. We unfortunately have limits as to what can be done to restrain speech on campus. We have a First Amendment, but we also have rules at Stanford University against intimidation and hate speech. So any students or others listening who feel unsafe or threatened or emotionally distraught by this conflict, I hope you'll reach out to faculty and staff that you trust, to individuals on the screen and others, and know that the university is committed to creating a safe and intellectually serious environment for this academic community. We were asked if we would put this recording online for future viewing. We certainly will do that on the FSI website. Once again, I want to thank our panelists, Amichai Magen, Ori Rabinowitz, Abbas Milani, our team at the Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies. Thank you all for joining us.